think we're just about time. Thank you everybody for coming to my session today. It's lovely to see quite so many faces. Hopefully you'll be smiling and nodding as I go through the presentation. So this session today is marketing cloud, the things that I wish I'd known. So in this particular setting, some of this is actually not going to talk about the technical pieces of marketing cloud or the functionality of the tool, which I'm happy to talk to anybody about later. But these are the things that I've learned through actually implementing the tool, and I'm going to go into those, each one of those in a bit more detail. Okay, so who am I and why am I talking about this particular topic? So, my name is Kerry Townsend. I'm an Associate Manager at Accenture, and I've been working with Salesforce for about 12 years now, predominantly on the core platform. If you want to talk to me on social media, the best place to find me is on Twitter. You can also find me on LinkedIn. I have a number of certifications. I'm pleased to have 10 so far, of which 5 are the marketing cloud ones, so I'm quite proud of that full set. They do some work. I also co-lead the London Marketing Cloud user group, and one of the reasons I do that is because I went through this journey and I was looking for a place to meet people and actually talk about this technology. I've also worked in marketing for 7 years, so my career has come up through an admin, and I worked in a marketing setting in there and took over the admin role within an organisation. So at that time, marketing automation was just starting. I was aware of tools like ExactTarget, but I didn't actually get to use them in practice there. But I had some practical marketing skills, so I thought when I knew more about Marketing Cloud and had the opportunity, I thought, oh, I know a little bit about this. Maybe I'll give this a go. And these are the things that I have learned during that process. And particularly, I think the key point is that my experience has been predominantly in Salesforce, and then I've come to Marketing Cloud. So I've actually looked at everything in Marketing Cloud through a Salesforce lens, and I've made some assumptions and had some expectations about how the tool will work. And this is where I'm going to unpick those and effectively explain to you all of those assumptions that I may have made, which I then found out could be a little bit different. So I've been using Marketing Cloud for approximately 18 months now, on and off, and because I work in a consultancy, I've worked with a couple of different clients, and everybody approaches things differently. That's one thing to remember. So the 8 things I'm going to talk about. First of all, I'm going to briefly touch on the technology, then the skill set, so that clearly affected me quite a lot, the support network and where I found information and where I didn't, and then how you might think about organising at scale, which is really a consideration in Marketing Cloud. And then I'm going to talk about the environment strategy. So again, I work in a consulting environment where we go in and we deliver products and services. So we would build capability and hand that over to the client. So for us, it's important that we actually develop an environment and then we release things into production. And in Marketing Cloud, you come to that in a different way. I'm also going to talk about the releases. So again, I've made an assumption that this was the same as core Salesforce, and it's not. And then I talk about the connector. And then finally, I don't want to spoil that final piece, so I'll leave a little bit of mystery there. But this, for me, is the talk that I wish that I had seen when I was starting out, because the things that I'm talking about are not necessarily the functionality, so you can't go onto the help and find these things. And then when you're working these out for yourself, you're looking for a way to validate them, and you're looking for other people who have actually worked practically with the tool to actually try and validate those. So this would have helped me. Also, I'd like to say that I'm not 100% an expert. So if there is anything that comes up in this talk and you actually have a different opinion, when we get to the end of the Q&A, I would love to hear it. If something that, you have a different view or you've worked in a different way, please do say it at the end on the recording so that everybody else can benefit from that knowledge. Because I think one of the things about the Marketing Cloud community is that we're all trying to learn from each other, and we're all trying to sort of ramp up our skill set, and in some cases that's not as easy as we hope. Okay, so I'm going to start with the technology, and one of the core pieces here is that it's not built on the core platform. So Marketing Cloud has come through a number of acquisitions, and I've highlighted a couple of the ones here, so ExactTarget, Buddy Media, and Radiant 6. and therefore it just doesn't behave in quite the same way, and it's something you just need to be aware of. There's also a different data approach. So when I started using Salesforce, it was very much like, well, you work out where the attributes fit in the data model. So is that a contact attribute? Okay. So email opt-out would be a contact attribute. You would put that in one place in the system. You build it into one table, and then you'd have that propagated through the rest of the system. So what I found quite alien for me is that's not quite how it works in Marketing Cloud. So you might build a core data model, but then you might actually, as a valid use case, replicate that data through the rest of the system. Because although in Marketing Cloud we would capture data in, say, a data extension, which is somewhat analogous to an object in Salesforce, when you actually use these data extensions at scale, you actually use them for email lists as well, which means that you might have multiple email lists which have very similar sets of data, or at least the very similar attributes in each one, and therefore this data gets propagated through the system quite a lot. And also, there are less guide rails, okay? So there are things that you can do and things that you can delete, and you're not going to get an error message that says maybe you shouldn't delete this, or maybe you shouldn't change that. So there are some things that you just need to sort of proceed with caution. There is a core data model, which you build within Contact Builder, and again, you can go in and make changes in there, and there are warnings to say that you might want to think about that, but those propagate through the rest of the system, and you just really need to think about what you're doing. So in Salesforce, over the last few years, we've seen some improvements where if you try and delete something, it will actually give you a warning message and say, oh, this is used over here, or this is used over there, and you don't actually currently get that so much in Marketing Cloud. So my recommendations here, okay, maybe a little bit farther with my train going off the rails. But again, you can make choices which mean that you have additional things to consider or work to do as you go through the process. And typically, Marketing Cloud is actually used by a lot of different people to do configurations. So in Service Cloud, you might be in a situation where your service users don't actually have admin access, and although you can do a level of permissioning in marketing, you still need to enable people that design campaigns and put those together to have access to these data tables and to make changes. So there is a level of consideration about what people can do at various points. So my recommendations here are don't make assumptions. So I work with a number of people, and in some cases, in the consulting environment I'm the person that knows the most about Marketing Cloud, and I'll go and talk to one of my colleagues who's a Salesforce solution architect, and I'll be like, well, surely it just does this. And you're like, I see where you've come to that conclusion, but actually it doesn't do that. And what might you need to do? But surely that information just comes through. So one of the examples might be, if you're using Salesforce and Marketing Cloud together, if you change the email address in Salesforce, it doesn't automatically propagate through to the master table or subscriber table in Marketing Cloud. So you have to design something in to do that. And there are reasons why, organisations might want to work in that in a different way, so there isn't something pre-built. But if you don't know to do that, if you have not tested that use case, then you won't know, and there's potentially an issue further down the line, which possibly a customer is going to bring up to you. And again, don't be afraid to potentially replicate the data throughout the system. I mean, I still struggle with this as a concept, but there are different reasons why you might do that. So you've got your core data model, but sometimes I've been in a situation where, say, a managed service team actually creates the emails, and therefore they create the subscriber lists, and actually someone with some technical skill with SQL has actually developed some flattened tables with them, which has all the attributes from multiple different sources in one table that they can interrogate. So there are reasons why you might choose to work in that way, but again, things like GDPR coming up, you need to be aware that wherever you're propagating that data, you need to have a way of being able to identify it and roll it out. So there are just a number of considerations.
So you say replicating and duplicating?
Yes, so effectively you might have, so like in Salesforce, I wouldn't necessarily have a list of contacts in more than one effectively table. But in Marketing Cloud, I might have multiple data extensions with exactly the same or similar sets of information. So I think it's typically like denormalizing the data, I think is one of the slightly more technical terms.
What are the data storage implications?
So it's not limited in the same way. So you can replicate. So there is, I mean, to say that there isn't a data storage limit in Marketing Cloud is wrong, but it's in completely a different way. So if you work with people that work with Marketing Cloud, they don't think about that data storage, and you can have sort of, well, I don't want to say means, but you can have a lot of these tables, and there are tools within there which allow you to set the retention on these, so that in theory they get rid of themselves over a period of time. But again, when you're first setting something up and using a tool, you don't think about that, and then after a while, you've got loads and loads of these tables. So also, a phrase that I find I'm saying lots just generally is just because you can doesn't mean you should. And I think that's a situation in a lot of cases. So an example I would give for that is there are a couple of different ways that you can bring data across from Service Cloud into Marketing Cloud. And depending on, some of those are easier to set up, so one of those is based on reports. So it's relatively easy to set up if you've got access to both systems, and you might bring them across as reports. But that's not the recommended Salesforce way of doing that. The recommended way is to use data stream. So just because you go into the UI and find a way of doing something doesn't necessarily mean that that's going to be, like it's going to work for all situations. I'll come back to that in a bit. So the skill set. So again, within Marketing Cloud, you've got a declarative piece, just like you have in Salesforce. But in addition to that, you've got AmpScript. Now that's a proprietary language for Marketing Cloud, which is predominantly around templating. And it's a very powerful tool which allows you to do a lot more. So that's definitely something to step into. Also SQL. So people will have SQL skills from like other areas, and that can be really powerful, as in that's the way that you effectively move data around the system and create these lists or groups of data that we potentially need. And then you've got all your front-end skills, so your HTML, your CSS, and your JavaScript. So again, we've seen a bit more of that moving into the Salesforce space now with Lightning components, but previously that wasn't a skill set that you would have with Salesforce, and your Apex and your Visual Force is not necessarily going to be able to help you much here, and to really leverage getting those high quality looking email templates. If you've got someone with experience in that, that's going to be really valuable. Another thing is that you can't ignore the regulation. I'd like to think that everyone in this room has heard of GDPR, but previously everybody also in their regions had a level of regulation about how you can and can't communicate with people. And if you've not really worked in that space before, that communication space, it's very easy to think, okay, well I'm just going to move, and I've worked in sales and service before, but now I'm actually going to move into Marketing Cloud. And again, have these conversations with people where they know that it's a thing and they know that it's important, but they don't fully understand that as this tool is a system of engagement, it needs to be at the heart of everything that you're thinking that you're doing. And either within your organisation or as a consultant, there will be people that specialise in that particular area, but what you need to do is make sure that they're at the table and that they are understanding that what you can do with this tool, and that they have the right to feed in and also validate what you're doing and testing to make sure that works. And also, marketing is a very sort of collaborative space, and unlike some of the other areas that we might work in, like sales and service, which is quite process oriented, and you go through these stages, and in many cases we're looking to make that more of a known process, because that allows us to automate much of it and it reduces the cost to serve. So in that setting, we're trying to make sure that those are, I don't use the word rigid, but they're defined as you go. With marketing, to actually get the value from that, there are pieces that change every time. So it has a framework in sense of you would have, you'd set some objectives and you'd know the types of approach that you're going to use. So you might use like email and SMS, but how you engage with that, the call to action that you ask for people, whether you need a web page as the back end to capture that, whether you're using Google Analytics to actually measure those metrics, and all sorts of different things are meaning that it's all very, it's a collaborative process. So in there, so I would suggest you want to develop new skills. There are lots of online web courses which you can do, because it's again a great skill to have. There is also an AMP script book which has come out, so if nobody's any heard of that, that's relatively new. Familiarise yourself with the GDPR functionality and also spend some time learning some marketing processes. So in terms of the support network, again, there are some MC-specific specialists. So there are people that have been working in MC for years that have not had any Salesforce experience, and therefore they are the sort of people that you want to be connecting with and following. In terms of community development, the Marketing Cloud community is not as mature as the Salesforce community, although we're seeing that now, but it is growing. And then also you're more dependent on support. So this is also improving, but typically when you've got an error message where you've written some SQL, it would just say there's an error, contact support. And in order to get any further information about what the problem is there, you would actually have to contact support and wait for them to get back to you. So anybody that works in Marketing Cloud, I've had a rule of thumb that if you can't fix it in 15 minutes, then you're raising a case. Which is absolutely completely opposite to how you approach something with Salesforce. So in here, some of the people that I recommend connecting or looking for online. So these two gentlemen here are the people that have actually just written the AMP script book, and they do courses. So that is Elliot Harper and Adam Spriggs, and then Jimson Lee is the person who is also a co-lead for a Marketing Cloud user group. So there are other places, so technical questions you would go to the Salesforce Stack Exchange. There's also some code snippets on GitHub which you might be interested in, but I would also say that the trailhead is growing, so that has not been as quick as for some of the other clouds, but that is definitely growing. Join a user group. If you don't have a user group, create a user group. Because that's effectively what we've done, and I have some people from my user group actually here, which is awesome. Now my slide advances works. Excellent. Okay, and also have a look at marketing processes and understand that they're just different. Even if you don't know them straight away, understand that they're different. There we go. There's also office hours, right? So I don't know if anybody's joined an office hours call, but every week there is a call where you can go on and ask live questions, which can be really helpful. So organising for scale. As I said, there's no, with data extensions, everything's in folders, and actually all the other assets are in folders, which means that when you come into the org here, I've used the clicker, you just get a blank folder. Right? And it's down to you to actually put in the rest of the structure. So some of the things that I've seen is like James' test folder, John's folder, and all of these things, and after a while that completely gets out of hand. It's fine when it's first there, but after a while you can't find anything, particularly if you're coming in and you're trying to work out what's happening. You can't, it's really, really difficult. And also, as I said, some things are not as appropriate for scale. So when I talked about the bringing data into Marketing Cloud using reports, actually using synchronized data extensions is a way that you would use it much more for scale. You'll also find in the system that you can still generate lists, but lists have a limit of about 500,000 people. So if you're looking at larger volumes of data, you want to start with data extensions. And again, otherwise you can end up using one tool for one job and then find that you need to change later. So again, I would say define terminology within the organisation. And this is my pet thing across all projects. Like the amount of time I've spent with Lost in sales and marketing talking about leads and what is a lead, and people talking about cross purposes has been way, way too long. And also enforce that terminology then through your file structure and your naming within the system. And make sure everybody understands what that actually means. And then think of Marketing Cloud as a set of tools in a toolkit. Right? So you want to make sure you're picking the right tool for the job. Okay, environment management. So now in Salesforce with Lightning Components you can get 25, something like that, sandboxes, which means that you're now not restricted in terms of your development environment. So you could work with production and just one pre-prod environment, or you could have dev, QA, SIT, UAT. You can do as many as you want. Marketing Cloud is business units. So they are not individual instances. So you have one instance of Marketing Cloud, which you'll have one login for, and within that you have a number of different business units within each. So you can connect those business units to different level environments. So you might have a prod instance of Salesforce and a prod instance of a business unit, and then you might have a non-prod version and a non-prod version of business units. The thing there is that actually business units come at an extra cost, right? So you need to consider that up front, and in some cases it's not a trivial cost. Okay, so you really need to think about that up front. So in here we might have also touched there isn't a dev org. Okay, so I've asked a lot of people for a dev org. If anybody knows how to get on a dev org, please let me know. You need to consider environments up front. Deployment is manual, as there are no commercially available deployment tools, so you need to plan that time in when you're moving things through environments. And also, something that I recently found, discourage people from refreshing their Salesforce org because it breaks the connection. You have to then go back in and rebuild pieces in Marketing Cloud. So don't do that. It depends what you've built. So now with, say, journeys, you can hook those directly into Service Cloud. Now, in this instance where I experienced that hadn't happened. But I don't know if that means that journey needs to be completely rebuilt, or I can just rebuild the entry source. But the thing is there that you're just not going to know until it's done. It's not; those things aren't tested or documented. So if someone does that, and you're like, okay, I don't really fully understand what the impact is now. We need to go and assess that and work out where that goes. And then releases. Releases are 5 times a year. So they are January, April, June, I think August and October. Again, which is different to Salesforce. Their functionality does get deprecated. So I've been in a situation before where I built a journey with an entry source. It was ready, waiting for me to deploy it into production. A release went by. They had deprecated the entry source that I used. I could then not create it in production. I needed to go back to the pre-prod environment, retest the new functionality, go through all the testing again, make sure that actually what I was doing was appropriate before I could deploy. So those things happen. And also the whole org upgrades. So all these business units are in one org, so you don't get advanced warning, like you get a sandbox in Salesforce that goes before the production org, so you don't get visibility, everything goes at the same time. If you're using this business unit. I mean, if you pay for a separate instance of Marketing Cloud, then that could be different, but no, I think they all go on the same day. So schedule the releases. Make sure that you deploy anything that you've got in production before it goes live, because they won't, like if it's live in production, it's still going to work. Like, if things are active, it's just not, you're not going to be able to activate new things. Do some regression testing, so once the org is gone, make sure that you actually do some testing yourself. It doesn't have, there's no concept of the hammer, there's no unit tests, so Salesforce has no way of running code in advance to find out what's actually, whether the changes they're going to make has an impact of anything in production. And then also, I've written here a plan to refactor that. There is new functionality, and to take advantage of that, you will need to revisit some of the things that you've built before and make a judgment about when you potentially build in those new pieces. So that's also important. Okay, the connector is definitely recommended. But as I mentioned before, some of the updates that people assume will be there aren't there automatically. Okay, so again, don't make assumptions, but the things that you could build automations for is updating the email address when it changes in Service Cloud, updating the email opt-out when it changes in Service Cloud, when leads convert, they will actually be a new person on your subscriber table. So you can write automations which take the person's email preference through to the new contact, and also goes through and deletes the old lead from the all subscriber table. But I mean, when I first started, I didn't know that. So, and then last but not least, the future is actually bright. So a lot of the things that I've told you here are like, these are the things that I've learned, because, you know, these are just the practical uses of the tool. But actually, the tool is continuously improving. And there are things that I needed to do to start with don't apply anymore. And we're looking to see that same level of improvement moving forward. And then also the product is growing. So a lot more people are using it. The areas that it can touch on, again, Salesforce are growing through acquisition, and therefore they're adding new pieces every time. It has the Salesforce focus, so I have spent some time explaining these things to product managers and what it's like to actually, like some of the challenges I've come across, they do listen. We are seeing that more resources are being diverted to actually, work on these. They acknowledge that, they want to bring these two clouds closer together. So a lot is happening in this space. And also digital marketing is really growing so much. We're all expecting such a rich cross-channel experience that, this is only an area which we're going to see more. So get involved, ladies and gentlemen. Get involved. People cannot recruit enough people to work in this space. Okay, so if you have any of these skills or you're more interested in being involved, then this is definitely somewhere where the growth is rapid, and also the community is growing. So more and more people are trying to help. We're seeing people like Elliot and Adam, they're generating a website, they've generated content. If you go on the Stack Exchange, you'll find that it's Adam and Elliot that answer like a significant number of those questions. And then also the user group. I mean, we get probably, between 40 and 60 people at our user group in London. And it's a great way to connect to people. And it's really those individual sort of connections that will help you moving forward. So these are some resources that, again, I've referenced some of the trailhead, I've referenced potentially some of the course things that I've seen. There's also a podcast. But again, get in touch. If there's anything that you want to talk to me about, I'm here for the rest of the day. But any questions?
Could you go back to the other slide?
Okay.
Yes. You have said that it's not okay to refresh samples, okay?
Yeah.
So do you think that it's okay to have just one business unit of production in Marketing Cloud?
So, I mean, that's a debate. When I say it's not only, ultimately, if you needed to refresh your Salesforce sandbox for a given reason, then you would need to do that. But I think what I want to highlight is that it has an implication, there's an impact somewhere else. So if you need to do that, you need to be aware of that up front and make sure that that is considered as part of, when we do this, the timing at which we do it and the resources we have available to rebuild those things in. So, I mean, I come from a Salesforce background, and the mantra is, you don't develop to prod. Right? In Salesforce, you don't develop a prod. No. You try not to do that. Okay? So, therefore, the question is, do you develop in prod in Marketing Cloud? And I mean, I believe that traditionally over time people have done that, and it's not quite like if you're creating some data extensions in the background, then that doesn't have, that's not touching anything else that you're doing within the system. But if you are using Salesforce and Marketing Cloud, if you take that approach, you're going to have more challenges if you need to change, say, the data model. right? Because you're going to have journeys that are running off this data model, and if you have then got to go and make changes in it, then, you know, even just to test something out to see if it works. So typically you'd have to still make those if you were going to deploy, but you'd have a deployment window, you'd be very clear, you'd understand if there was going to be any outage, and then you'd time box that, and you knew that the changes you were going to make were going to work. So as a general rule, I would say that you would ideally want at least a non-prod version, which you can do those sort of testing. However, it comes at a cost. So then that's down to every individual organisation to weigh up what choices they make. And all of these things end up being a trade-off in some form or another. It's just like, well, are we going to pay this amount of money and understand these changes and also understand that we need to deploy through a number of different environments, therefore that's going to have a time implication and take up resources, or are we going to take the risk? And what is that risk? And for you as any organisation, what are you doing? What is the risk? How much would that just impact you internally, or how much would it impact external users? Right? And all of these pieces are, you know, I can say, oh no, you'd want a business unit for all of your 5 environments and everything, but the reality is that isn't quite, we don't have the luxury of doing that. There's always a time and a cost to effort, so. Yeah, but as a general rule, particularly if you're doing anything with contact builder and anything like that, I would say.
And the journey builders.
Yes, yeah, a non-prod environment makes me feel owned, because you know I go in there and I change stuff and I'm like, you're like, is it okay? Is it okay? Is everything? Have I broken something? You know, so I mean, for my personal anxiety levels, absolutely, I prefer to have an environment. Anything else?
In this bright future,
Yeah.
what is your opinion about the collaboration with Google Analytics? Is it going to bring to marketing?
I would like to think so, right? So I've had limited exposure to it so far, but it sounds very interesting and very exciting. And it's really building those pieces together, because I think, so I'm working on mainly an enterprise setting, and therefore the organisations that are typically going to have an element of Google Analytics, like do some Google Analytics, and therefore the closer that we bring all of those pieces together allows us to loop in those bits and bring marketing less into the art that it was, where people were, oh, this creative is amazing, so I'm sure it will deliver results, into looping those pieces back together to actually be able to, see if that actually does that. So, I mean, I'm optimistic about it, but I haven't seen the pieces, and I don't believe I think somewhere in April, like with the marketing cloud release, but I don't think it's fully available yet. So I'm excited to see more. I haven't even seen any whiz-bang demos. So, but right now, yes. Yes. Hello.
Hi. A lot of people.
That's the last question.
Yeah.
And you can catch up with Kerry and they want the FAQ. No, go ahead, but that's the last one, and then you can catch up with Kerry.
A lot of people juggle with the concept of how do I decide what tool to use, Pardot or Marketing Cloud?
Yeah.
Is there sort of like a line that you follow?
I think there's quite a clear separation generally. So, I mean, as a general rule, Pardot is more of a B2B and Marketing Cloud is more B2C. Right? As a general, doesn't mean that you wouldn't cross over both. So the types of tools that you get in Pardot is Pardot links into your website quite heavily, and then when you go as a lead on the website, it's bringing you in as a visitor, and it's understanding that someone has visited the website, and when you perform various actions, you can score people, and then those people bubble to the top. So if you're in a B2B setting and you're doing personal selling, and someone's coming to your website and they're looking at, the price list, or they're looking at product features, they bubble up to the top, and then at some point, the system can help you understand that a person should start engaging with this person. Okay, so, and although you can do all the email tools and those sort of things, it's not, and some stuff on social, it's not really, it's where there's a human involved in actually closing that sale and it's bubbling those people up. Marketing Cloud is much more B2C, where things are typically more transactional. So you would be sending someone emails or communications across different channels to engage them in various behaviour and move them along their cycle, but nobody internally is checking that, Kerry over here went on the website. The volumes are much larger, the way that the data aggregates up is much bigger. So you're looking at sort of overall conversions, you're looking at how people en masse maybe responded to an email and where they went on Google Analytics and that sort of thing, which in a B2B setting, you're not going to do individually. So,
That's helpful.
but I do find that, we work with organisations which have both. So they might be a consumer, they might have a consumer arm, but then they also have a B2B piece, and their individual sales teams are working very much with hard So, there might be bits when you cross over, but that's where I typically see.
Cool, thank you.
Your team, watch me try and use my phone. It's so embarrassing. Bear with me, it's nearly there. Oh no. We're sure we're still recording this one. Do you know what? We're going to pano. Hi ladies and gentlemen. Let's go. Hey there. Hey there.